A very warm welcome to you all. My name is Jessica Lankford-Frost, and I'm the Policy Officer at NOUT. It's my pleasure to be chairing today's event on navigating rural realities. Firstly, I'd like to quickly run through a few housekeeping announcements, some of which are shown on screen. Do use the Q&A function throughout the event to put questions to our speakers, and the chat function to interact with your fellow delegates and to share any information or links. If you require any technical support, please do post in the chat, and my NOUT colleagues will try their best to help. The closed caption feature, subtitles, can be accessed by all attendees at any time during today's event. After the event, we will send you the presentation slides used today, the chat, and any other useful information. And we will also be inviting your feedback on today's event, so please do look out for the feedback form, which should pop up on your screens following the conclusion of the webinar. Now, NOUT would like to thank its partners, Clear Council's Insurance, CCLA, and Blusher Illuminations for their extensive support for today's NOUT online event. Today's event will show us that while approximately 70% of local councils thrive in rural areas with populations under 10,000, the national spotlight often leans towards urban agendas. And it's time to shift the focus and reassess rural councils and their residents' challenges, including deprivation, poor broadband connectivity, post office and bank branch closures, and social isolation. We'll hear different perspectives on the challenges facing local councils and their residents. So gain a competitive edge in addressing the intricate challenges that rural councils face and leave valuable practical advice and tips to steer your local council confidently into the future. So I'm thrilled to be joined today by a brilliant panel of speakers. Nadine Trout, Assistant Chief Executive at the Rural Services Network, Natalie Turner, Deputy Director at the Centre for Aging Better, and Corinne Plichino, Chief Executive at Action with Communities in Rural England. Now, without further ado, I will hand over to Nadine. Over to you, Nadine.
Good morning, everyone. Just checking that you can see my slides. That should have all come through. So hello, I'm Nadine. I'm the Assistant Chief Executive at the Rural Services Network, and I've been with the RSN for nearly 5 years and have a background in rural development, strategy commissioning and marketing, working both in England and overseas. I'm fortunate enough to live and work in a vibrant rural village on the South Cornish coast, a village I grew up in, but I could only afford to return to in recent years. But enough about me. Let me go on to tell you about the work of the Rural Services Network. So the network is a network of over 500 organisations, including fellow speaker organisations, ACRE, and our host NALC. And the network spans the public, private and third sectors, with representations from small community organisations through to large corporates, and includes national charities, local authorities, community, parish and town councils, utility companies, transport operators, housing associations, health trusts and more, all with the common goal of delivering services to rural communities. The RSN is the only organisation representing all of these sectors, and we are the national champion for rural services. Our driving force is to campaign for a fair deal for rural communities, and we promote the rural cause by providing data, insight, publications, events, and delivering national campaigns. Our current campaign is Delivering for Rural, which we launched last year in Parliament and covers key themes affecting rural communities, namely access to funding, employment, health and care, affordable housing, transport, digital connectivity and more. The Delivering for Rural campaign calls on government to redress the inequalities faced by rural communities and invest in them so that they can fulfil their full potential. In essence, rural residents pay more, earn less, and have access to fewer services. The RSN is therefore fighting for fairer public sector funding. Councils have been underfunded for over a decade by successive governments, even though it costs more to deliver services in rural areas. where populations are more dispersed. This is because rural areas cover a staggering 90% of England's landmass, but accommodate only 1/6 of the population. So as a result, rural residents, to compensate for government underfunding, pay more for fewer services. In fact, rural residents on average pay 20% more in council tax. This simply isn't fair. No politician would dream of adding, say, a 20% increase in VAT or indeed any other tax in, say, just Liverpool and nowhere else in England. Liverpudlians would quite rightly be up in arms if this were the case. And yet it's deemed acceptable for rural residents to pay more through additional taxation. This graph clearly shows the disparity in funding between urban and rural areas, with urban areas currently set to receive 41% more in funding. So urban funding is on the up, whilst, sorry, I just realised I just flipped on to another slide there. Urban funding is on the up, while rural funding is set to flatline. But to be clear, the Rural Services Network isn't pitting itself against urban areas and saying that they are less deserving. Our stance is that everyone deserves access to good services, regardless of where they live. And yet rural areas are often see withdrawal of services that are deemed discretionary. So, for example, they might be the closures of leisure centres, libraries, community transport provision and public conveniences, while their urban counterparts spend double the amount on these services due to increased government funding and investment. Again, this simply isn't right. So what's the RSN doing about it? Well, we're working with the parliamentarians via the Rural Services All Parliamentary Group by providing briefing papers and responding to government consultations and policy announcements. We're working closely with the media to highlight rural challenges and celebrate successes. We're commissioning research to underpin our argument to inform select committees, parliamentary debate and the government funding formula. And we're sitting at the table with key decision makers, including the Rural Coalition, DEFRA Rural Insight Forum, the LGA People and Places Board, the BT Digital Switchover Advisory Group, Rural Housing Alliance, the National Centre for Rural Health and Care, the National Rural Crime Network. The list goes on. And why we do this is to galvanise the opinions of rural communities and ensure that their voices are heard. And last but not least, we're hosting informative, lively debates with leading national speakers and rural service experts and celebrating best practice. Because we believe that by acting together, rural communities will count. So if you'd like to join our growing network, please get in touch and I'll be happy to follow up with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Nadine. Now, over to you, Natalie.
Thanks, Jessica. Olivia, I think you probably move over to the next slide and I'll let you. Thank you. Just to give you a little bit of an overview of who we are, we're the Centre for Ageing Better, which are pioneering ways to make ageing better a reality for everyone. We're funded by the National Lottery Communities Fund, and the team that I lead and the area of work that I manage is particularly around work with places, because of all sizes, shapes and geographies, to help them prepare for an ageing population. We publish resources, we do direct support, but one of our key mechanisms is through the UK network of age-friendly communities. Currently has around 90 communities, and that's from small towns, districts, counties, all the way through to city regions. Next slide. So why do we exist and why should we matter to you? Because we're aging as a nation. This slide, I'm conscious this might be small depending on the size of your device, so I'll talk you through what it essentially means. Shows that we're aging as a nation and that this is set to continue. In the purple bars, this shows population change over the next 20 years and the green bars over the next 40 years. And if you can see the detail, you'll see that we're not actually expecting very many changes all the way up until the ages of around 64 and over. But we'll start to see a sharp increase now and in the future around the 65 to 79-year-old age group, but particularly that 80 plus, as a doubling of the population who are 80 plus in the next 40 years. That's easier to say when it's written down than it is when I'm tripping over the words. But that's a number that has already tripled in the last 40. So I think that's really just identifying the changing population. Next slide. And this isn't happening evenly across the country. I'm sure I'm not talking to anyone who doesn't know that. There are big differences between places. Rural and coastal areas are already on average older than urban areas, but that aging is also happening more quickly than the rest of the country. The map here shows dark blue, where between 30 and 40% is already age 65 and over. And this projection, we're right in the middle of these two maps in a way. This is about 10 years ago on the left and the next 14 years on the right. And you'll see that change is looking quite dramatic. Next slide. But it's not all doom and gloom, right? So just giving a little bit of perspective around rural versus urban places. Rural communities can be really good places to grow older and to be old. On average, we know that people in rural areas are healthier and wealthier than urban counterparts. They report much greater well-being and trust in their neighbours. There are also higher levels of home ownership. These are all good outcomes for people. But we also recognise that those averages can hide big inequalities in rural areas. Those higher levels of home ownership can disguise higher levels of fuel poverty, with many older homeowners asset rich but cash poor. I'm sure you've heard that phrase before. Strong community spirit and social capital can mask pockets of social isolation, and that's a particularly an issue for people who are physically less mobile. And that higher wealth and average life expectancies overall can hide some small communities with much poorer outcomes. So we know that some smaller remote villages in particular can have high levels of deprivation. And we know that coastal areas have higher levels of mental health, for example. Next slide, please. Just going to pick out a couple of things here. I've picked out some areas that we've sort of, we focus on as an organisation, because those pros and cons of rural areas are also reflected in people's health. So while people are healthier, tend to do more physical activity and live longer than in urban areas, there are some challenges which have already been mentioned briefly. Things like actually access to affordable, healthy food is particularly in smaller villages is an issue. Access to health services. And there's some nuance around that. With work, that's another area, and economy. There are much higher employment rates and lower rates of economic inactivity in all age groups, in the people in their 50s and 60s as well. But because the rural business base tends to be dominated by SMEs, that means there's a higher proportion of lower paid, lower skilled, and quite often high physical and seasonal work. That can be a bigger issue when you're drawing your workforce from your older population base, leading to issues around people who acquire health conditions who might not be able to keep up with the physical work, but also affects your ability, that security of work, and lower pay can affect ability to save for retirement. So that matters for later life financial security. We also know that employers in rural areas often face particular skill shortages, and the health and care sector, which is also facing higher demand, that can be a particular issue. So the health and care workforce in rural areas. Next slide, please. Just a quick overview here around housing and communities. More people are in their own home, which is great, but homes in rural areas are often older, often harder to repair and heat, and also less suited to adaptation, which you can also see is an issue for an aging population. And we know that some of the current models of supported housing, care, extra care, aren't well suited to rural areas. It can tend to be more expensive to deliver, not enough concentrated demand in some smaller areas. So people sometimes find themselves as they get older having to move into suburban areas to get the kind of care they need and leaving their networks, their families, and where they've lived their lives. Higher levels of social capital and cohesion we talked about. People trust each other, neighbours and communities look out for and help each other. That's a real positive. That can help fill gaps where services aren't literally physically reaching. But there are kind of the issues around poorer transport, digital infrastructure, People being more likely to live away from services and each other means too often it has to fill the gap of essential services, and that's not something that we want to be relying on. So I've just kind of given you a little bit of a whistle-stop tour through some of the big issues that we see coming up for rural areas. But there are things you can do, or we think can be done. Number 8. Number 8. Next slide, please. Slide 8. So just the sort of things that I think to tackle these are, don't assume, find out about who your older population is. We were in Cornwall a week or two ago, and tends to be an assumption about inward migration of retirees in later life being a strain on health and care services, for example. It can be a bit of a myth around that. But actually, we know in Cornwall, people are moving earlier in their 50s and 60s. Nadine being potentially one of those as well, with years of work and good health and contributions to make ahead of them. And so I think it's about checking who your older population is, how well they're aging, where they're coming from, and what assets they have as well. Don't stereotype. Older people aren't necessarily the burden we tend to pigeonhole them as, but they are volunteer more than any other age group and are the backbone of rural communities. We know that the highest level of volunteering across the country is in the southwest, and one of the reasons for that is the older population in that area. Some of the things you can do is helping people connect to contribute those assets as well. So volunteering fairs, aging well fairs, ambassador schemes, investing in those networking sort of schemes to help people contribute and to connect to each other and provide information can be key. But also the assets that you have, like anchor institutions, local businesses, they can model age-friendly employment, they can be meeting places. And then, so the small is beautiful is like addressing some of those many rural areas are testing smaller cooperative or community-led care models where larger providers won't go. So you can really innovate as well. And then finally, learning from others. And if you take it to the next slide, please, Olivia. That's our network of age-friendly communities. Currently, actually, it's 91 members. Just highlighting there all of those rural areas that are in our network. We have resources, we have guides, we have others. So if you're interested in becoming part of that network and learning from others about the good practice that they are sharing with each other, we'd be really happy to speak to anyone here. That's it from me.
Thank you, Natalie. Please do continue putting your questions in the Q&A box. You can also upvote questions in there that you want answered first as well by clicking on the thumbs up next to the question. Now, over to you, Corinne.
Thank you very much, Jessica. I'll just wait for my slide to appear. And while it is, just to say thank you again for inviting me to join you today. I joined ACRE at the back end of May last year, 1 week after the general election had been called, and my feet have barely touched the ground since. It is, of course, an immensely fluid and uncertain time for rural areas, but also a time of potential opportunity, and I'd like to try and touch on both of those sentiments in my comments today. Next slide, please. Thank you, Olivia. So I plan to cover these items in my comments. I thought it would be useful, though, to start with a brief introduction to ACRE and to our member network, which I hope will provide some useful context for the comments that I'm going on to make, and also potentially some valuable introductions for colleagues on the call today. Thank you. Next slide. So ACRE, if you don't know us, speaks up for and supports rural communities across England. We are the only national charity representing rural communities as a whole. We're not focused on a specific sector or issue, but we do place an emphasis on those who are most disadvantaged by where they live. We represent, support and work with a network of 38 county-based organisations, our members, also charitable bodies, who provide advice and support for rural communities on the ground. And many of them can trace their origins back to the early 20th century, but between them they have many decades of experience and are embedded in their local communities. and as such have extensive connections across local government and civil society. And I was very struck by the comments Natalie made in her presentation. Many of the issues that she touched on are ones that our members are engaged in at local level on the ground. So this combination of both activity at local level and also the national perspective gives us at ACRE a really rich vein of expertise and experience to draw on, which we use to contribute to the national policy making process, to enable local action through our network, and to support people in need to address specific challenges. Next slide, please. And you can see here a map of our coverage and just some examples, some statistics which give you a sense of the scope and the scale of the ACRE network. If you don't know the ACRE member in your local area, please do go to our website, acre.org.uk, and you'll see on the home page there's a button which says Find ACRE in your county. And if you press that, you'll go through to this map, and then you'll be able to trace the way through to your local ACRE member. Thank you. Next slide. Often when I make presentations to groups, and I'm not, by the way, including this group in this comment, I'm often struck by the lack of knowledge and awareness there is about some of the issues that face rural communities. And again, both the previous speakers have already touched on this. And if you press the next button, thank you, Olivia, you will see just a series of statistics come up. And there are many, many more, some of which you've heard today, which I share to just try and make the point that we have a perception of the rural idyll, but actually it's more nuanced than that. The other thing, of course, that we come across a lot in our conversations with policymakers is this assumption is that rural equals agriculture. And while that, of course, is very much a part of rural life, in reality, rural communities are so much more. I should add, though, as well as a place of challenge, I think it's really important to make this point that rural areas are a place of wonderful untapped potential. And that this positive perspective is as important as the work that we do to ensure issues such as rural deprivation and poor access to services are addressed. And indeed, the two, of course, are interlinked. Next slide, please. So with that in mind now, I'd like to touch on three different subject areas which we're currently working on and which I thought would be particular interest to you today. And the first one is one that I'm sure you're very familiar with, which is the persistent lack of rural affordable housing. And just to share a few more statistics with you, which I think are always very striking, based, for example, on the 2021 census, we know that just 9% of housing stock in rural areas is social housing, compared to 17% in urban areas. And we know that in 23% of parishes at that time, with a population of between 300 and 3,000, there were 2 or less social dwellings in those parishes. And I can give you similar contrasts between the rural and the urban, which show consistently that the provision of social housing is less, it is on a downward trend. And in addition to that, there are challenges both in terms of house ownership and in the rental market, which are more accentuated in rural than urban areas, with the exception of London. So with this in mind, then, our activity is focused on two areas. The first, at a national level, is the work that we do to influence and contribute to policy making. And as you can see here, we focus on two fronts at the moment. One is the proposed changes to planning policy, and the other is housing policy. And I've listed here some of the key items that we're particularly focused on. Note in particular that really important point at the beginning, the definition of affordable. And although in the newly updated NPPF, the government has made some adjustments around the margins, the definition still remains 80% of the market rate. As they say, do the math. That's not necessarily helpful. And we have an awful lot of new housing coming, which is going to have affordability based on that criteria. The other thing that I think is really important to highlight in this list is the work that's doing to try and ensure that we have access to the right houses in the right places, which again, of course, is really vital in a rural setting. But the other area where we're doing work is more at a local level, where ACRE manages something called the Rural Housing Enabler Programme, which you may know. This is funded by DEFRA, 2.5 million allocated over the course of the current financial year, to fund these posts rural housing enablers who work in 34 rural counties across England to broker conversations between residents, local authorities, builders and landowners to help secure housing that meets local need. And they also gather information and intelligence, which we can then share with DEFRA to help inform future policy refinement. And we're currently waiting to hear if that programme will be renewed in April. Thank you. Next slide, please. I said I would talk about the positive as well as the negative. And so I wanted for that reason to say a few words about community benefits, which we think could be, if structured appropriately, a positive addition for rural communities. You may be familiar with this term. It's essentially the concept of providing benefits, usually in financial form, to communities which are required to host major new infrastructure projects related to power generation and transmission. Now, they're not without controversy, as I'm sure you can understand. And there was a body of work done by the last government consulting on how this process might work. It does already happen on an ad hoc basis. Some of it's going on in Scotland. There are also a few examples in England. But the essence is essentially there is a financial payback, remuneration, one could debate the word, which goes to communities who, as I say, are hosting this infrastructure. And there's a debate about the model it might be. At one end, it's should there be money off your electricity bills for a certain period of time, right the way through to the development of more extensive funds. You'll see here the particular points that we're focused on. The new government has picked this up, as you would expect, given its very significant ambition to extend energy infrastructure across the country and its desire to reach net zero. And of course, you'll also realise that a very, very significant proportion of that infrastructure is going to sit in rural areas in order to benefit urban communities. And for that reason, we support the principle of community benefits, but the devil will be in the detail. And we're currently engaged with government on some of the issues you see here to ensure that we have a consistent approach, that communities as a whole should benefit. That should be a long-term benefit because that infrastructure is going to be there for a very long time. But also, really importantly, this third point, that the money emerging from these schemes, which will largely come through the power generating and transmission companies, should not replace public investment. So this should not be seen as a trade-off. Oh, we'll bring in new money and therefore we'll reduce public sector funding. This should be in addition to. And that's a really important point that we will be focused on as these debates continue. And I believe there's going to be a consultation on this shortly. Next slide, please. I just wanted to close briefly by talking about flooding. I live between Worcestershire and Worcester and Malvern. We have a lot of water in the area at the moment, and I'm sure a lot of you do too. And I just wanted to briefly mention this partnership, which was launched last autumn, driven primarily by the Environment Agency and the NFU. You'll see 6 core member organisations there. And we're engaged in a variety of different activities which are designed to address these 3 areas of focus at the bottom here: building evidence, enabling access and facilitating access to quality support, and also engaging rural communities in helping them to develop their flood resilience programmes. Now, there is an immense amount going on in this area already, and indeed that's one of the things we're thinking about as a partnership, where is there opportunity for clearer guidance and a clearer focus for rural communities. We're also very keen to work with parish and town councils in this area, and I was very grateful to Jonathan Owen, who we met last week for an initial conversation, and we will be coming back to discuss this further, and I hope I'll have more opportunity to speak to NALC members about it. But just to say that this is recently started, it's something we're working on, and we'll be coming back for further discussion about it with you. I'm going to close there. Thank you very much, Jessica. I hope that was helpful.
Thank you, Corinne. Just a reminder, if you could please keep putting your questions for our speakers today in the Q&A box, and we will start answering some of them now. So first question, I think this is for all of you. What difference will local government reorganisation make to your activities, particularly in areas where district councils may be abolished? Do any of you, who wants to start with that question? Natalie?
Thanks. I think, well, there's two things going on, aren't there, with the local government reorganisation? There's the move or push towards unitary, and also the strategic authorities, combined authorities move as well. So I think there's two things. I think people are going to be occupied with moving the furniture around for the next few years. So I think in terms of being able to deliver changes, what I'm seeing, we've got a partnership with Lincolnshire, which is navigating a move to part of a combined authority with two other areas which are unitary and also facing becoming a unitary itself. It's currently got 7 districts or 6 districts and a borough. So I think there's that bit, but for housing, for example, so one of the areas we work in is around people who are low income homeowners who can't adapt and update their own homes, who are living in basically homes that are non-decent. And one of the issues we have is organising services across districts and county levels. So things like the disabled facilities grants, planning, planning in its broadest sense as well. But actually the cooperation that's needed across unitaries, I think will be simplified actually, but I still think that it will take some time to get there, but potentially it could be more able to deliver across those boundaries. But yeah, that's just one area that I see sort of potential opportunities. I'm sure there will be others that can think.
Thank you, Natalie. Corinne, do you want to come in there?
Yes, certainly. Thank you. Yes, this is one of the many big issues on our agenda at the moment. And I just jotted down a few thoughts that might be interesting to share. I think at the most basic level, what's really interesting about the reorganisation is ensuring that the rural voice continues to be heard. Depending on how the new tiers of local government and the strategic authorities are organised, one of the issues we need to watch really carefully is that in particular, if a set of rural areas is linked to a more urban area, that the urban area doesn't dominate, because obviously that district level perspective is lost. So a lot of this is going to be about the detail of what goes on. Equally though, the election of mayors, and we've seen this to some extent in Yorkshire, some mayors are really enthusiastic to support the rural perspective. So there is, I think, a lot of time and effort being put in by our network to understand how different organisations might coalesce together, but B, ensuring, as I say, they are conscious of and aware of rural issues. Which brings me on to my second point, which is just the recalibration of local relationships and services. And our members do provide services in some places on contract to currently to districts as well as to counties. So there will be a reorganisation of those services. The third point I wanted to make is, of course, given what I was saying about an understanding of the local and particularly of the rural, I think this is a very interesting opportunity for parish and town councils. So thinking of colleagues here today, how they might be able to step forward and ensure that that voice is heard is really exciting. And then the fourth and final effort, whatever happens, this is going to absorb local authority time and effort. And on the assumption that this is going to go on probably for 2 to 3 years, if not more in some areas, it's just worth bearing in mind that this, along with all the other things that are going on and are expected of local government, are, I think, going to just absorb bandwidth. And that's something that we're also conscious of. Thanks.
Thank you, Corinne. Nadine, do you want to come in there?
No, I would absolutely echo the points that Corinne and Natalie have made. I mean, we work with councils across all tiers of local government, and we'll continue to work with them. We don't have a stance with regards to sort of where that reorganisation, or what the boundary should be. That's very much up to local geographies to decide what works best for them. But what we see is key is ensuring that whatever the new makeup is that they are properly funded, and that they take into account the needs of rural communities. And we too are, sort of doing work in the background, identifying, sort of where those combined authorities are already, looking at the makeup of those combined authorities, which ones have rural in their makeup, with a view to potentially, sort of creating a rural mayors group for the future. That again, we bring like-minded people together to fight the cause for rural communities.
Thank you. Now, our next question, I think this is going to be for you, Corinne, and Nadine, possibly as well. It's about opportunities for younger folks, younger people in rural areas. So, so especially 30 years and under. The question says, I see very little evidence on apprenticeships being developed in meaningful numbers, with SMEs dominating the commercial environment in rural areas. I wonder whether there needs to be more enhanced financial incentives to generate more apprenticeships. Do either of you have a view on that?
I would echo those sentiments. So where I shared in my presentation the Delivering for Rural campaign, underneath each of the elements of our campaign, we talk, for example, about rural economies, and we've got a set of asks that we make of government, and it's absolutely recognising that rural areas, there is a proliferation. That's what dominates our economy is SMEs, so small medium enterprises. And they absolutely, sort of need support. And so in the past, I mean, my background for many years, I managed economic development for 2 local authorities. And so, we had regional development agencies, and then we moved into local enterprise partnerships, sort of again, sort of different organisations delivering things. But I think where they make a difference is in that business support that they provide, that is really easy to access, and to assist those SMEs in embracing apprenticeship programmes. And so, that's really important that those are part of our ask moving forward, is that there is that financial provision there to make that business advice available and accessible to small rural businesses.
Brilliant, thank you.
Jessica, I would just, if I may, just add a very brief point. I think it's also worth bearing in mind, and I do appreciate it varies in different parts of the country, that we also have some very big employers sitting in rural areas. If we think of some of the business parks that have emerged over the last 20, 25 years, as a case in point, we have some very, very big companies there now who are sitting in essentially a rural setting. So I think it's important not to just see apprenticeships in rural areas through the SME viewpoint, although I absolutely accept all the points that Nadine has just made. I'm also looking down the chat, and I know we've got a question coming up about transport. It's very difficult to disentangle local employment for young people from provision from public transport, but I know we'll come back to that. Thank you, Jessica.
Thank you. And Natalie, did you want to come in there?
Very briefly add, but I think it goes back to the reorganisation, is that the devolution of work and skills budgets to strategic authorities may provide an opportunity to bring some of that decision making more locally. And then also, as a nod to the realities, the largest age group in rural areas is 50-54-year-olds. So when you're thinking about apprenticeships and particularly retraining for emerging industries, try and think about promoting apprenticeships for all age groups, because it is families that need work, and they need to be retrained as well, especially as people are going to be working for another 20 years, 25 years in their 50s.
Great, thank you. I thought that as it's been mentioned, we'll come on to the question about rural affordable, rural public transport. So how do we overcome that? How, and particularly how can parish and town councils help overcome that? You want to come in, any of you?
One thing I would just say briefly, Jessica, is I'm sure colleagues are aware that one of the pieces of legislation that the new government is bringing forward in this session is the Better Buses Bill. And that's going to look at a recasting of the franchising model. And again, one of the areas that we're active on is trying to ensure that there is as the potential for franchising, and therefore more authority is passed down to a wider range of local councils, accepting the changes that we've just talked about in the devolution agenda. We're pushing hard for there to be more requirement, that there is broader thinking about connectivity outside urban and suburban areas, but also across boundaries, because that's the other issue that's worth bearing in mind as well, that people travel across boundaries, but we don't want franchising to constrain some of those routes. But yes, I actually think this is one of the most difficult and consistently intractable problems that rural communities have faced for decades. And one also hopes that, going back to the earlier comment made by colleagues, that there might also be an opportunity for more innovation and testing at local level. I know also public transport, this is different from public transport, but another thing we perhaps haven't got time to touch on today, but might do in the future, is how are we going to move to net zero transport in rural areas? That's a huge challenge in terms of the infrastructure that's needed if there's going to be a serious movement away from combustion engines. But that perhaps is a topic for another day. Thank you.
Thank you, Corinne. Natalie?
Thanks, Jessica. Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? So I think the franchising perspective is potentially an opportunity. I think it's really difficult over large rural areas. I know we have a partnership with Greater Manchester. We know that Transport for Greater Manchester is mortgaged up to the hilt to try and make its B network work in the same way as the Transport for London does, because you need high demand, you need big numbers to kind of make that work. So I think it's all very well to be given these opportunities, but the funding has to come with it, especially for rural areas, I think. There is some opportunity for tech. We did some work with the Transport Department of Transport looking at things like driverless cars. I know that's moved away, but there are a lot of things around on-demand type transport and community transport that may come down the route, that may sort of help fill some of the gaps and help understand where the demand needs to be. But I think that links into connectivity in general, because transport is just one element of connectivity and the challenge in rural areas. I think that seeing transport and digital connectivity together, especially with remote working, and thinking about it, how people use it to move around communities or commute, I think will be key. We see a lot of really good practice around again, looking at where we are now rather than the future. Old and rural communities being much more car dependent. Again, challenging those myths around unsafe older drivers and thinking about how we keep people driving more confidently and safer for longer. Older drivers are not the most unsafe people on the roads. And a lot of those sort of myths mean that we don't build ways of helping people use. I mean, I know we have the carbon zero issue, as Corinne's pointed out, but actually people are going to need to use their cars, and volunteer driver schemes have, all of those, thinking about who we've got, how we keep them driving, how we keep them moving themselves and others around for longer. I think there's some ways of thinking about that too.
Thank you, Natalie. Nadine, do you want to come in there?
Yeah, I would agree with the points that were made. We were recently asked to contribute to the Transport Select Committee on rural buses, and our feedback from our members. So we have community transport associations in our membership, for example. We have bus operators that are in our membership. We have local authorities that run transport provision, and sort of the issues there with regards to a lot of it is economies of scale and the cost of delivering. It's just not economically viable. It's not commercially viable to run routes in rural areas. So it's about sort of finding ways to overcome that, which is key, and also just accepting that there is a higher prevalence of car ownership in rural areas, and that's because of necessity, because there just isn't the frequency of buses that you would see in sort of urban areas. And I know a while back a lot was made of kind of like the £2 bus fare cap, and and how it was being extended and how that's great. And it's great if you have a bus in the first place. If you don't have a bus in the first place, whether you have a £2 cap is immaterial. And I certainly struggle on a daily basis of getting my teenage children to school, because there is no bus provision from my village to get them there. So yeah, it's something that we do need to work on, and to just continue to highlight the needs in rural areas.
Thank you, Nadine. I'll just follow that up by saying that a few years ago, now worked with Transport Planning Association to develop the Good Councillor's Guide to Transport Planning, which I'll put in the chat. It includes some examples of where parish and town councils have run their own community transport schemes. So I will save that in chat. Now, the next question to yourself, Corinne, it's about does Acre engage with the big developers over social housing? This person says they see ink spots of affordable housing, but a dearth of social housing.
Thank you, Jessica. Forgive me, I haven't seen it in the chat and I didn't catch all of your question, but I think I've got the gist of it. Yes, so to explain, what we focus on in Acre is affordable rural housing to meet local need, and our focus is on essentially very, very small developments. I'm talking here about 6, 7, 8, maybe 10, 11, 12 developments of houses, usually on the edges of villages, to meet very specific defined need. And through that Rural Housing Enabler programme that I talked about, we have a methodology for working with local stakeholders to try and assess that need and to try and bring the parties together. And through that, we've gathered a lot of knowledge about what the potential barriers are to those very small developments and also what the potential policy levers might be. What we don't engage in is debate about, big developments and how much social housing or affordable housing there should be on those, simply because there are other organisations that do that. Although our basic thrust is very much that big developments, even if they're located in rural areas, must include affordable. But that goes back to my previous point about what do you mean about affordable? Because if affordable is really just a bit less than the market price, that isn't really going to address your problem. But we're very, very focused on the very specific needs of specific villages and local areas. Do we engage with the big developers? Yes, to some extent. We also do a lot of work with what's called registered providers. So those are organisations who are registered to provide social housing. We're interested in both the provision of housing for sale, but also provision of housing for rent. But again, not entirely dissimilar to some of the comments that Nadine was making about how the commercial implications of running bus services in rural areas. The big developers have a limited interest in very, very small developments because of the costs involved, the scale of the costs, and the economies of scale. And so often our conversations are going on, as I say, with registered providers and smaller local builders for whom the work is potentially more attractive. But forgive me, I'm giving you a very potted answer to what is actually quite a complex question, because it will vary from area to area in those 34 counties that I mentioned. I hope that's a helpful answer, or a start of a helpful answer, Jessica. Thank you.
Yes, definitely. I don't know if either Nadine or Natalie, either of your organisations engage with big developers over social housing.
We haven't engaged with big developers over social housing. That's what, that's not what we do. But it's interesting. We had a meeting just last week with Rent Plus, and they have a model that actually isn't based on, it's based on home ownership. So it's making affordable housing available from the outset, but with the premise of whoever occupies those homes being able to buy that home. So it's not shared ownership either. I mean, from the outset, what happens is you take on a property, you pay your rent, you pay a little bit extra, and then you own that property and you own it forevermore. It's not as though it's, when you then sell, it then goes back into shared ownership. So there are models out there, and that model, kind of isn't reliant on any kind of grant funding, because they have their own funding to support that. So yeah, I mean, we work with just lots of different groupings that are providing housing in different ways.
Thank you, Nadine. Natalie, did you want to come in on that at all?
But I have huge amounts of experience around this particular one, but much more around similar issues around provision of retirement housing, like big, very unaffordable developments that, where we need to try and free up some of those bigger homes, and actually there's nowhere affordable for people to move. It doesn't add up, to go and buy a nice 2-bed flat in and I shouldn't say name names, but an M&S, let's say, development, which are very nice but very expensive. So very similar issues at the other end of the line.
Okay, thank you. Now a question that kind of acknowledges the common ground between the RSN and ACRE. I don't know, perhaps you'd like to kind of highlight perhaps some of the different things you do as well, if possible.
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry, would you mind repeating the question, Jessica?
Yeah,
It's a bit
yeah.
difficult to hear,
So
sorry.
the actual question is, it seems
Yes.
that the RSN and ACRE are both occupying a lot of common space. And it says, is this sufficient? So I sort of paraphrased on that slightly and said,
Lovely. Thank you.
explain some of the differences.
Corin, if you click on the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen, you'll see these questions coming in.
Oh, I see. I'm looking at the chat. That's fabulous. Thanks so much. So yeah, to answer the question, I mean, hopefully Nadine will agree with me, but I'm sure I think that the difference is that we are there to represent and look after different groups of people. Now, we're in a similar space, which is the rural affairs space, and we work together on many things. But I think the difference is, whereas Nadine is speaking up for service providers, and of course those service providers are very important to rural communities, we're speaking up for rural communities, for rural people. And in addition to that, we are providing services directly for them on a charitable basis, and that's the difference. So in some cases, we will be in discussion with Nadine's members about how we can help them to deliver a service, but we would be providing it for them, or we would be working with other organisations to do that. I think also we perhaps focus on a broader range of issues, depending on what's on the government's agenda at the time. But I think we would feel that we're representing communities, and so there may be occasions when we take a different view to the RSN for that reason, but hopefully not too many. Thank you.
No, and I think a key difference as well is ACRE actually has government funding, whereas the Rural Services Network is an independent organisation, and so I think our independence allows us to be potentially more critical of government at times as well, because we don't receive funding from them.
What might be useful is just if I may, to clarify the funding point, because that is quite helpful. That's an important point. So ACRE receives funding from a number of sources, of which government is just one, and we're commissioned to do two things by government. One is the Rural Housing Enabler Programme, which I mentioned earlier. We've also traditionally distributed some funding for village halls as well, following a competitive process where we were chosen to do that. And so some of you may even know village halls or been part of those applications for bids to improve, for example, renovations and upgrades of village halls connected with the Platinum Jubilee, for example. What we also do for DEFRA, and I think this is a really interesting example of how over time some of the infrastructure that previous governments had in place to look after, develop policy for, and oversee in rural settings has slowly, over many years, and I'm not pointing a finger at any one government here, has slowly been dismantled. And so one of the things that we also do is receive funding to help ensure that the rural voice is heard at local level. And so our 38 members are involved, for example, in engagement with local government and with other service providers and organisations such as the Police and Crime Commissioner would be an example, where we're ensuring that the rural perspective is heard in those discussions at strategic level. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of a sense, and also where you may have seen some of our members at local level. Thank you.
Thank you. Now a kind of follow-on question from that for yourself, Corinne and Nadine. Do your different organisations and other similar organisations, such as CPRE, collaborate and coordinate action, especially to lobby government, such as on the revision of the NPPF?
Yes, all the time. It depends obviously on the issue. It depends on the degree of common ground, but there's a constant dialogue ongoing. And we also sit in a more formal arrangement called the Rural Coalition, which I think Nadine mentioned in her introduction, which is an alliance of 12 organisations, of which NALC is also one, who work on specific areas of policy development together. But yeah, there's a constant dialogue going on, and also with others outside the rural affairs sector as well, where relevant. I mean, Nadine, I'm sure you want to add to that, but that would be my start for 10.
No, I would say, yeah, the CPRE are one of our members, but they also, as you say, they form part of the Rural Coalition, and the Rural Services Network is part of that, along with, as we said, you know, sort of the NFU and others. I mean, there are times when we don't all agree on the same things because we're representing different interests, but often there is that commonality, and we will come together to write to ministers as a result of that, to lend that weight. And that's why I think it's really important that that there is that collaboration, because, as I said at the end of our presentation, you know, together we count. You know, rather than being a lone voice in just one organisation, we have more clout when we can come together and all sing off the same sheet.
Thank you. Now, a question for yourself, Corinne. How does someone on this call contact ACRE about the flooding resilience? Is it possible to do that at the moment if we're in a parish or town council?
Yeah, so two thoughts. It might be useful to connect with your local ACRE member. And as I say, you'll be able to find those by going onto our website to the front page, and there's a little button at the top. I think it's a blue button, and it says Finding ACRE or Finding Us in Your County. What we're also looking to do with NALC, and I don't want to preempt those discussions, as I say, I just caught up with Jonathan last week, is looking at sort of working at a more strategic level on how NALC might be able to contribute to and benefit from the partnership. And that's something we're going to be looking at over the coming weeks. So I don't want to preempt that, but certainly if you wish to make contact at local level, please do. And I'm sure our members would be really delighted to hear from you. I should add, in some cases, I think those relationships are already there. Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you. And if you're able to, please feel free to share any links in the chat. Now, next question. Is there any scope for the development of new garden villages based on community land trust principles and structures such as community benefits? And they gave Letchworth as an example of a garden city or garden village. Does anyone want to take this question about development of new garden villages?
I think that's an interesting one. I mean, because there's some thinking that in order to meet the government's housing targets, is it a case of, sort of actually just provision being made in existing sort of settlements across the country, as opposed to building new developments. I actually sat on a community land trust when I worked for a previous local authority, which was to do with a development, which is basically a new town that was just built outside of the city, that provided housing for 6,500 new dwellings. And it's really interesting just to see what dynamic that had on the surrounding area, sort of, putting that infrastructure in that way. And I think, it needs careful consideration to think about how those areas would work. And again, it's ensuring that whatever you create, that you have that provision through Section 106 agreements or whatever else, to ensure that there are services there, that there are doctors' surgeries, that there are schools, that there are sort of transport links, to ensure that they function as places.
Thank you. I don't know if Corinne or Natalie, you want to come in on that? Okay, we'll move on to the next question then. So this says, we're a rural village in the green belt. We will have a 38-hectare solar farm being built. We have no facilities and a population of about 600. The likelihood of any improvement to the community is remote, because our needs will not be able to overcome the greenbelt policy. This is added to the precepts paid by residents. How can the panelists in addressing this not uncommon problem? Pretty sure that's quite a long question. It's in the chat if you want to have a look. Don't know if any of you want to comment on it.
Forgive me, I wasn't sure if the questioner was asking whether they could get any benefit from the solar farm, or whether it was a more general comment about the challenge of bringing resources, facilities, I beg your pardon, into the village. What I would say, if it's in relation to the first, that point I was making about community benefits, our efforts are going into trying to ensure that developments like this in future would bring tangible and appropriate benefits to the communities. So that's my reason for picking that up, is that we feel that as the government moves to try and have a more consistent, structured process, which it doesn't have at the moment, it's done on an entirely ad hoc basis. We want to see that consistency and structure so that communities do benefit in a proportionate and sustained way. So that would be my contribution. I'm very sorry that hasn't happened before this solar farm was built. But colleagues may have a comment on the other point. Thank you.
Nadine or Natalie, do you want to come in there?
Yeah, I'm just unpicking the question as well. My reading of it is that, yes, the community is set to benefit from some funding, and they don't have any facilities at present, so that funding could presumably have built facilities, but they're unable to build those facilities because of restrictions of being in the greenbelt. Yeah. It's a tricky one without knowing the detail, but I also know, if there are existing buildings within that community, whether they might be repurposed, I don't know, to help provide services in some way. One of our member organisations, for example, is Plunkett, and they provide advice to communities on running community shops, for example, or setting up community businesses. So yeah, without knowing the area, I don't know whether there's any public space in that community or not that might
Jessica,
be repurposed with that money.
Sorry, Nadine, Jessica, I think the gentleman's sort of added a bit more information at the bottom, and I sort of now see that what he's essentially saying is, I think, that they're sort of stuck in a cycle, which I get. That's very interesting, and I'll take that back to make sure that we are incorporating that point into some of our comments. That's an important point about if we bring these benefits in, we need to be able to use them. So let me pick that up. Thank you. That's a very helpful example.
Yeah. Okay. So just a reminder to delegates, we have got a few more minutes for if you've got any last questions to put into the chat. I will just pick up on a couple I know you answered earlier, Nadine. So first of all, we had one on are there any costs for becoming part of the Rural Services Network? And I know, Nadine, you put your email address in the Q&A box. I don't know if you want to put it in the chat as well to let people know if they're interested in joining the Rural Services Network.
Yeah, it's basically to contact me because yes, it's paid for membership, and there are different levels. So yeah, I can just post in the chat what I put in the Q&A.
And the other question was about how is a rural area officially defined? And I know, Nadine, you linked to DEFRA's rural urban classification, which we can put in the chat. I don't know if Natalie or Corinne, you want to come in on that?
I think it's certainly worth putting the classification in, but my goodness me, that's a big question. And we could probably talk about that for a long time. And I think it's a really interesting one, not just in terms of how different organisations and not least government classify it, but also perceptions of that, and perceptions of that from policymakers, which almost brings us back to where we started this meeting. Because that is key. Another thing that we have been active on, and will continue to be active on, is the index of multiple deprivation, which some colleagues might be familiar with, which is an absolutely fundamental tool for government to decide where it wishes to allocate resource. And we're seeing a lot of that going on in the moment. And in fact, some of that reference earlier from the RSN about reallocation of local government funding is linked to that. The problem with it is it's fundamentally flawed in terms of the rural, because by definition, one of the metrics is size of population. So therefore, if you're living in a rural area, that means that you are seen as this, essentially that skews the deprivation metric against you. That's an enormous issue. It's a complex one. It involves a lot of detailed work at the ONS, but we have been working on that for some time. Nadine, I'm sure you have at the RSN as well. And it's something we need to keep pushing on, because I think there are some moves to make, some adjustments, but really that's one of the fundamental tools that government uses to make decisions. If that tool is not appropriate, then we are going to see a continued lack of understanding, I think, about some of the challenges in rural areas. Colleagues may have something to add on that. Thanks, Jessica.
Thanks, Corinne. Nadine or Natalie, do you want to come in there on that? Sorry.
No, I mean, we've absolutely picked that point up with regards to the indices of multiple deprivation in our of response to government on a consultation that's live at the moment. The issue is that, you know, deprivation in rural areas is hidden. It's very clear to see in urban areas, because what the indices does is it looks at, you know, sort of the massing of deprivation. And the problem is that, you know, that's not picked up on rural areas because it's too widely spread. That's not to say that, you know, those residents aren't as much need as those in urban areas, and it's something that needs to be challenged.
Yeah, I think it goes to, there was I can't remember whether it was in the chat or one of the questions early on around how can people be both wealthy in rural areas and not wealthy in rural areas, depending on the report you read. And the point I was making earlier on is that it's on average, and on average covers an awful lot at a local authority level, which covers a lot of geography as well. So, and it also goes back that to really lots of other things that have been sort of slowly cut over the years or disappeared over time, is the ability to really understand at a very local level who your population is and what's going on with them. Loss of investment in surveys, loss of being able to disaggregate down to the smallest level. Even we find it when it comes to age is an issue. So if you can do anything to really understand your local population and what is going on for them, and being able to point to those areas, it can help. It can help you focus your resources, obviously, but also it may also help you advocate for more in your direction if there is a willing ear. That's one of the things we find.
Great, thank you, Natalie. Now we've had a question that's probably best put to other parish councils, but I wonder if you had any experience of working with working in areas where there's been local government reform, the number of staff working at the principal authority has been cut, or the number of staff working for the, you know, in the local government sector in that county has been cut, and as a consequence, services and assets were devolved to parish councils who had less funds and struggled to cope. So that's something that you've been aware of, particularly Corinne and Nadine, in your work with parish councils.
I would just say that we ran we've got a grouping called a Rural Market Towns Group, and we had presentations recently by both Falmouth and Launceston Town Council, or Lanson, I don't know where, Paul Chapman, just in Cornwall, and just saying how they had worked with their local authority on devolving those services, and you know, it's fine, but there has to be, you know, they can't just get the asset and then no money that comes with it. That's the key thing. So I think it's about, you know, sort of, ensuring that they are win-wins for you know, sort of councils that are taking on those services. And that's key, and then continued dialogue and understanding the needs, as Natalie has just said, of what the local community is. It might not be a case of, you know, continuing to deliver what was there previously. So when we had the event where we spoke about those devolution of those services, was actually they took this opportunity to change the offering, to ensure that it better met what local people wanted, and they did that by consulting with local people, asking, you know, sort of what they wanted from a service before just trying to continue it in its, in the same vein.
Thank you. Corinne, I don't know if you wanted to comment there.
No, in ACRE, the national organisation, we don't do any work directly with parish councils, but I would have a detailed insight of some of the things being discussed. I'm sure our members would, though, if any colleagues wish to contact them directly. Thank you.
Thank you, Corinne. Now, I think we'll wrap up today's event. So could I ask you to sum up by providing one thing local councils in rural areas can start doing kind of straight away to help their communities? I don't know if you want to start with you, Natalie. You've got one.
I think the one thing I touched on it in my presentation and here as well is don't just assume or stereotype your aging population, but really try and understand who they are, what their needs are, but also what they have to offer. Tends to be, and whenever we talk about older people in any area, not just rural, is a sort of, well, yes, but how do we get more young people in? And let's think about that. And actually, we have to kind of start to understand this is the reality we are living in as a whole country. Our population is changing. It's something to be celebrated. And we need to think about that as an asset and how we keep them contributing, particularly considering they already are the backbone of so many rural communities.
Thank you. Corinne, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I think I would encourage colleagues to first of all be mindful of some of these bigger changes going on around the devolution agenda, to think about how they both in their areas, the role that they might play in a reorganised system. And obviously that's something that also complements the work that NALC is doing nationally. And I think finally I would say, and think beyond your own borders as well, your own boundaries, and think about how collaboration might assist both your own immediate population, but also collectively a wider group. Thank you.
Thank you. Nadine?
Yeah, I would say make your needs known to your local MPs. Ultimately, sort of when we talk about reorganisation, what we want to ensure is, okay, yeah, the deck chairs might move, but we need to ensure that there are resources for those new organisations, that when they are reorganised. So I think it's a case of putting the pressure on, sort of your local MPs, saying about what your needs are, and what MPs, sort of love is actual real examples of how it's affecting individuals. So if you can share with them, sort of the challenges faced, not just a case of, stats and facts as we've done lots of today, but actually that human element of saying, well, look, this is how this particular resident is affected, I think is key, because it brings colour and meaning to, sort of what's being faced in rural areas.
Thank you. So I'll say a huge thanks to our fantastic speakers, Nadine, Natalie and Corinne, for their valuable and insightful contributions today. Please do fill out our feedback form when it appears on your screen. Our post-event mailing will include the chat and any presentations you saw today. And now we'd like to say a huge thank you again to our partners for today's online event, Clear Council's Insurance, CCLA and Bless Share Illuminations. And don't forget to check out our brilliant events programme for events coming up through the spring. Thank you for joining today. Goodbye.